Dr. Luke Wood is a distinguished professor of education and the Associate Vice President of Faculty Diversity and Inclusion at San Diego State University. It's a Hispanic serving institution, just so you know. Dr. Wood is also the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, CCEAL, a national research and practice center that has data collection and training partnerships with over 150 schools, colleges, and universities across the nation. Wood's research focuses on factors affecting the success of boys and men of color in education. He has delivered over 750 scholarly and conference presentations and has authored over 140 publications, including nearly 70 peer-reviewed journal articles and 14 books. His most recent books include Teaching Boys and Young Men of Color with Frank Harris III and Advancing Black Male Success from Preschool to Ph.D. with Sean Harper. There are books for sale at the end of the event outside at a discounted price of $20. We only have 50 books and there's more than 50 people. So first come, first serve. $20 cash or check will accept. And I hope he signed. This is my personal copy. And I got notes in here. So he's written a lot. His forthcoming book, Black Minds Matter, Black Minds Pedagogy as a Tool for Civil Resistance, will be released this fall. And in fact, I think it is already released. I think it dropped, so he's got another book out. He's prolific. Dr. Wood has been regularly sought out for his expertise by media outlets such as the New York Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, Huffington Post, Fortune Magazine, Los Angeles Times, the list goes on. Even C-SPAN, right? C-SPAN is for real nerds, so we know that people are checking his work out. During the Obama administration, his research was featured through the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans and My Brother's Keeper initiative. He now serves as a National Advisory Board member for RISE, Boys and Men of Color, a research and evaluation initiative of the Executive Alliance. Dr. Wood is a former recipient of the Sally Casanova Predoctoral Fellowship, from which he served as Research Fellow at Stanford Institute for Higher Education Research at Stanford University. Wood received his Ph.D. in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with an emphasis in higher education. And get this, this is where I think we'll be very, very excited to hear, and a master's degree in curriculum instruction and early childhood education from Arizona State University. He holds a master's degree in higher educational leadership and student affairs and a bachelor's degree in Black history and politics from California State University, Sacramento. So our dean, why don't you come down, Dean? And he's going to present our lecture with a plaque, and while he does that, I want to pull up something. How far can I go? Yeah. Renee's trying to bait him up. So you got to get into the screen. Yeah.
The dean is on there.
So we'd like to present this plaque. Dr. Wood is the second visiting professor. Dr. Bonner came over the summer. And so we'd like to present our plaque to you.
Thank you. But before we do that, right, you know, this is called the Dean's Visiting Urban Teacher Education Series, right? But I gotta let you know that Dr. Hartlep, otherwise known as Nicholas, is being very gracious, right? Very gracious, because this probably needs to be renamed the Dr. Nicholas Hartlep, right, Distinguished Speaker Series, because certainly you've got to give credit where credit's due, right? Dr. Hartlep, among others, thank you, has been really the, as you say in the cycling world, right, the Tour de France, right, the diesel engine behind all of this. And so I also want to, you know, I think we should give it up for Dr. Hartlep as well for all his work. And I'm starstruck, right, because you're here, right? So I know that we have urban ed students here. If you are an urban ed student, right, please clap. Thank you. And, you know, Dr. Wood, we have pre-service teachers, we have in-service teachers, community activists here. You you know, and those things, right, aren't in silos, but I think all of our folks here, their identities intersect, right? So they're teaching, and they're also, it's all part and parcel of the same project, so I applaud your presence here. Thank you for gracing us with your presence, right? Another round of claps for those of you who identify as resident faculty or community faculty here at Metro State University. Please clap. That was good, that was good, that was good. I like it, I like it, I like it. Community folks, welcome, welcome, welcome to this incredible talk. I'd be remiss if I were not to, I mean, you're all important, you're all important. I'd be remiss if I were not to acknowledge the presence and support, right, of Dr. Amy Gort, who's our provost and executive vice president of Academic Student Affairs. So the senior administration is very, very supportive of these initiatives, and we appreciate your presence here as well. Am I forgetting anything, Dr. Nicholas? Am I forgetting anything?
All the faculty who had students, encouraged students to come, really thank you. I know Dr. R.B. Banks and others encouraged students to come. So you all have received CEUs. You should keep those. If you haven't gotten a CEU sheet of paper, see me at the end of the lecture and we'll make sure you leave with that. I think that's it. Dean, any other comments before we start the show?
Well, I want to thank Lupe Sanchez.
Sure.
Lupe Sanchez, our office manager, right, for her support.
Lupe will be out selling books as well, so make sure you get a copy. We're getting a discounted price from Luke's publisher. So.
And one last thing, I guess, before I present the plaque and what we call some swag here. Not all of you may have gotten a copy. Thank you for the reminder. You're going to do that all night long.
All night long.
Please invoice me. I'll send you a check in the mail after this.
I appreciate it.
This handout, I think, is also very important. So if you did not receive a copy, if you could share for right now, we'll do all we can to get you a copy of this flyer as well. So let me just move over here real quick, okay? And now it's my pleasure to present Dr. David Wood with the following. First of all, right, we made it a point to order swag. And there's a reason for that, right? Because we know that you're going to probably display your swag. Inside this swag bag, you're going to have a coffee mug, right? And it's going to say School Urban Education. So when you're in San Diego, you don't have to like make it a point to really show it around while you're having your great weather. So on behalf of all of us here, right, the fine taxpayers, right, have a lot to do with swag. Please, this is for you as a swag guy on behalf of all of us. And last but not least, on behalf of everybody here present, we present this plaque to you. Dr. Luke Wood, Dean's Visiting Urban Teacher, Education Research Scholar, Fall 2018, presented by Metropolitan State University, School of Urban Education, Dr. Wood.
So I'm going to say one thing. Take out your phones. You know, professors, we like to push back and say, put your phones away. You know, I'm going to embrace it. Take out your phone, everybody. I know you got smartphones. Take it out. Go to this link, menti.com, please. MENTI.com, please. There's only 2 questions I'm asking you, and I'll talk while you're doing that. We need data. We need data on everything we do, so please answer these questions for me. Who are you? Go to menti.com and use the code 633102. If you're listening on Facebook Live, do it on your home computer. You can do it too. And then we'll see who's in the audience. I mean, anyone that's given public lectures really knows that it's important to know who are you talking to. So this helps Dr. Wood. It also helps us in terms of when I ask the provost for money or support, be like, hey, you know, 90 people came. Dr. Gort, can you give us a little resources? So who's in the room? Put it in code 633102, and then type in who you are. I'll give you some wait time, and then we'll transition the slide to the next question, and then Dr. Wood will be able to do what he came to do, is to share with us. And for those in the audience, take a look at who's in the room. We got community members, Metro State students, pre-service folk. Sign science education students. And at the bottom right-hand corner, it tells you how many people have phoned in a response. I attend Metro State, I'm a pre-service. I know by the Eventbrite we do have in-service practitioners. A lot of students in different licensure areas. Someone wrote a light. I don't know what that means.
I can explain it.
Minneapolis public school teacher, yes, yes. Starting a special ed cohort. We're also, I have some flyers at the end of the evening for our master's program. So for those folks who want to get a master's of science in urban education, see me at the end and we'll get you information about our programs. All right, I'll transition to the next slide. This is the last slide and then Dr. Wood will take it over. How can we advance black male student success from preschool to Ph.D.? You know, we have early childhood and elementary programs here at Metro State. You know, I mentioned Dr. Wood's training and the car ride over for dinner. You know, he was talking about his work, you know, in preschool spaces. He's like, this is where it begins, you know. And so how can we advance? Someone said learning, educating, the educator, encouraging and positive role models. More teachers of color, absolutely. If you don't know, Metro State's created with that sole mission is to create and graduate teachers of color, licensed teachers of color. Love and empower. All right. So I don't want to take too much time, so we'll transition over to Dr. Wood. So take it over.
So first of all, thank you all for being here in the rain. It's really just a pleasure to see this group of people. Thank you for the invitation from Renee and from Nicholas and from Provost for being here. It's really just a pleasure to be able to be here and talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing. I say we because though I'll talk about my research is oftentimes very collaboratively done, so I don't ever want to say it's my research. It's really the research of a number of different individuals who've been focused on these issues. So we'll be talking about the topic of advancing black male success from preschool through PhD, but I'll also add one caveat, which is that my training really kind of centers in two different areas, community colleges and early childhood. So there's gonna be kind of a gap in between that a little bit, so you're gonna see, you'll see what some of that looks like. I've also kind of subtitled this presentation Black Minds Matter because it's part of an ongoing initiative that we have as part of our center to elevate black minds, really recognizing the brilliance, dignity, and morality of black students in general. And so you'll see that as part of this as well. In terms of my contact information, I usually don't bring business cards, so if you would like to reach me, just take the picture. You can also hit me up on social media. I'm looking forward to engaging you, whether you send me an email or whether you hit me up. By the way, looking forward to it. Sound good? All right, so two different books I want to point out. So one is the Black Male Success. This is an edited book that I did with Sean Harper. Anyone ever heard the name Sean Harper before? Okay, so for the folks who raise their hand, you are obviously blessed to have had the opportunity to read his work. If you haven't, go and look up his work this evening. Sean Harper, he does amazing research. I mean, a lot of it does focus on black males, but it also focuses on really just equity issues in education. His center just released a report which rated colleges and universities across the country in terms of how they're serving black students. And so each school or university got 4 different grades, and so you might want to check out the work that he's done. And then also the book that was just recently released ended up changing the title a little bit. Black Minds Matter, Realizing the Brilliance, Dignity, and Morality of Black Males in Education. And I totally messed up. I brought the first copy of the book to give to Nicholas, and I left it at home. So I will send it wherever Nicholas is. I will send it to him. So you'll see a little bit of a meld of that. So a little bit about me and my background. So my training, again, as I mentioned, a lot of it focuses on community colleges. Anyone here ever attended a community college before? Okay. So you're my people. Okay, so I started out in the field working at a community college in Sacramento, California, doing outreach and missions, but working primarily with guys who were coming out of the prison release and helping to transition them into college, and then try to support them as they were navigating the college experience. As part of that, I became very dismayed with essentially the work that was being done. I felt like, hey, we could do a really good job of getting people in the door, but we don't always do a good job of supporting them once they get there. And so that criticism is really what led me to the work that I do today, which is not just focused on those who are formerly incarcerated, but really looking at a lot of our populations that are most disadvantaged. So with the work that I do, our center, I'm a co-director of the Center Community College Equity Assessment Lab. Basically what we do is we partner with community colleges across the country, and we support them in building their capacity to serve underserved students of color. Primarily, our focus is on Black, Latinx, Southeast Asian, Native American, and Pacific Islander students. Those are the 5 demographics we focus on. Our center also houses the Black Minds Project, which does a lot of the work that you're going to see that's focused on Black males. We do research, we do training, we do assessment. So in general, what we do is we partner with the college, we collect data from faculty, data from students, data from staff, and then we help them to basically understand that data to better inform interventions that they're going to take at the institution. So a couple parts of this, and as I mentioned, we have the Black Minds Project, which is under our center. It's a project that I lead as part of it. And essentially we do a few different things, and this is all really part of that kind of same effort. So one, we had a course called Black Minds Matter. Did anyone participate in that course? One person participated, thank you. So for those who haven't, there'll be an opportunity for you to be able to, at the end, I'll talk about what that looks like. But essentially what the course did is we tried to draw parallels between how Black males are policed in society and how they're educated in schools. And a lot of my talk is really gonna focus on the parallels between those two worlds. So after that, we released a series of reports that focused on suspensions in the state of California. The first report was called Get Out, and it was a report that went across the state. It really highlighted K-12 institutions that are over-suspending Black males across the state. And what we did is we looked specifically at just one-year suspension rates, and we found some really interesting patterns in terms of what it looked like. Obviously, we found that the greatest suspensions are taking place in middle school, and then kind of after that high school, which is to be expected. But we found that the greatest disparity is actually taking place in early childhood education in terms of the representation. In fact, we did a follow-up report focused on Sacramento County because Sacramento is the capital of California. And we titled that report The Capital of Suspensions because they have the #1 and #3 suspension district in the state. And in that county, Black boys in early childhood are 9.9 times more likely to be suspended than their peers. And so it was data like that that really helped to advance those kind of conversations. So we made a few people a little unhappy, but we felt like we did some good because we know that there are schools and school districts now who are engaged in responding to the information that was brought to light. We have some more work that we're doing that's going to come out as part of this. So after that, we're moving to our No More Dumping Grounds, basically a series of reports that focuses on special education, and not just special education, but the overplacement of Black boys, in particular in special education. And special education is an incredibly wonderful service that's absolutely needed for a number of our students. But what we do is we become concerned when we find it being used as a dumping ground when teachers don't necessarily know how to engage certain populations. And so we're doing that. We're going to be releasing a report. We've identified schools and school districts that have exorbitantly high placement rates. And I'm not talking about schools that have like, hey, we have a special focus on serving students with disabilities. No, we're talking about public schools that are using special education, again, unfortunately, as a dumping ground. So then what we're going to do after we release that series of reports is we're going to put it all together in our final report, which is going to be called the Terrible 20. And what we're going to do is we're going to overlay the map of school districts that have high suspensions with school districts that have high overplacements, and we're going to identify the top 20 worst districts for Black males in the state. So it's safe to say that there'll be some folks who aren't happy about it, but ultimately, what I always say is this: are you more than happy that we raised it to your attention, or more happy that these are the results that you actually have? And what we find is that people tend to be more unhappy with the results themselves. And then we have some other studies we're doing. I won't go into all of it, except to say that this is a really cool one that's coming out. We've been looking at school plays, and this is part of my research team is working on. So Darielle Blevins, who's one of my doctoral students, she's doing some amazing work in this, and so we're partnering on this. Looking at school plays in early childhood that take place, and we've gone through thousands of hours of videos, watching them and coding them for microaggressions, and how they communicate microaggressions and stereotypes about certain populations. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Separate from that, we have a consortium that we run with community colleges, with about 130 of them across the country. We have some that are represented in this state. And basically what we do is we provide like monthly professional development on how to teach, counsel, advise, mentor, build programs, in general educate men of color, and really focusing on building the capacity of educators. Oftentimes there's a focus on blaming students, blaming their families, blaming their communities because we have deficit perspectives. And so we oftentimes find that when educators see breakdowns in student performance, that they like to rationalize it through, you know, what is going on with these guys? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? They kind of have that perspective. And what we try to do is shift that. So instead of focusing on remediating students, we're remediating educators who are working with them. And it's a very different philosophy. So we collect data. I'm not going to go into all that. We collect lots of it. And our webinars are all free, so if you ever wanted to go check them out, you just go to our website, seal.org, it's cceal.org. And this is just some of them. We've done over 30 on different topics that might be of interest. So what I wanted to start out with, other than that preamble, was this chart right here. So what we do oftentimes when we go to a college or university is that we're going there to partner with them, or school, to really engage in a professional development initiative that's designed to address equity issues. So you heard that, you know, that I've done 750 talks. Many of those talks have been professional development sessions with educators. In fact, in the past 3 years, I've probably done at least 400 or 500 just on microaggressions and unconscious bias alone, right? So that's kind of like our jam. That's what we do. We do a lot of training on that. And this is what usually happens. We go out to school, we're going to do training on microaggressions, let's say that's the topic, and it's an optional session, it's a brown bag, anyone who can come who wants to come. So the people who are putting it on invite students, they invite faculty, they invite staff, they bring them into a room, and basically have us come and give some development. As part of that, one of the things that we recognize is that oftentimes the person who was putting on the event would be kind of like dismayed and unhappy. We get to the room and be like, oh, you have 30, 40 people. It looks like, hey, this looks like a good event to me. You know, we're just glad to be able to be here and talk to individuals. And we find that the person, again, putting on was dismayed. And oftentimes it's because when they decided to do a session on microaggressions, it's because of Jerry in chemistry, who everyone knows microaggresses the hell out of the students, right? But is Jerry going to come to a voluntary session on microaggressions? No, not at all, right? And so what we did is we developed this framework for thinking about how you can reach people who are typically not being reached. So recognizing that there are different educators with different motivations around this work. And so basically it's based upon two different characteristics. First, knowing what to do, and second, having the willingness to do it. Right? And those things aren't always connected. For example, I know how to work out, but I don't always do it as much as I should, right? So there could be a disconnect between what we know and what we actually do. So we break down into these 4 quadrants, and these 4 quadrants represent different types of educators. The top one you see is a KW. Those are people who both know what to do and they have a willingness to do it. What do you think we could call individuals who would fit in that category? Those who both know what to do and they have a willingness to do it.
Successful?
Successful, that's good. Was that it? Anyone else? Educators. Leaders.
Engaging.
Competent, engaging. Sometimes we hear champions. Sometimes we hear advocates. Every now and then someone will say unicorn because they're hard to find. But in reality, we call them the choir, right? These are individuals who, if there's a session on any type of topic that's dealing with diversity, equity, social justice, inclusion, they're going to be there because they have an intrinsic commitment to that type of work. And so oftentimes if you go to a place to do a voluntary session, you're talking to people who are part of the choir, right? And that's okay, because even then, if you know what to do, you still have a lot to learn. You still have to sharpen your tools. I'm learning every day, you know, even though I go off and I do training on these different topics, and I'm learning new stuff about them every single day. So it's important for us to engage the choir. The second group are the allies. The allies are those who have a commitment to doing the work, especially when it comes to, or when we're talking about, you know, in context of today's topic, black boys, men. They know what to do, but I shouldn't say they know what to do. They don't know what to do, but they do have a willingness to do it. So the bridge between those who are allies and those who are choirs is really knowledge and information. The idea is this: if we can train them, then we can have them become part of the choir. Now, most of the people, I'm going to say everybody in this room, everybody, is probably part of the choir of the allies, right? That's what normally happens in most of the talks that we do. Now, there are some other individuals that we also have to recognize when we're trying to engage in an institutional initiative around this kind of work. You have your resistors and you have your defiants. Your resistors can be broken down into two categories, but in general, they don't know what to do and they're unwilling to do it. The first group are active resistors. Active resistors will actively resist. They'll hear that I'm coming to talk about, say, black males, and they'll send an email out to every single faculty and staff person on campus telling them don't come. That it's reverse racism, reverse discrimination. Why are we talking about males of color or boys of color? Shouldn't we be talking about fill in the blank, right? Or everybody's typically the response, right? But focusing on everybody doesn't work, because a rising tide does not lift all boats. But that's another conversation. So sometimes they'll be very vocal about it, right? We've had times where we've come out to do trainings and the administration has thought that the effort really wasn't something they wanted to be part of. So the president at one institution held a mandatory meeting at the same time with all management to prevent them from going.
Wow.
But in all fairness, most people who are resistors aren't active. They're passive resistors, and that's the second one. These are individuals who really are going to vote by their lack of presence. They're not going to raise a fuss. They're not going to say anything. They're not going to make a big deal about it. They'll smile. They'll even take the flyer and say, "Oh yeah, I might show up," right? Because they don't really care about the work. And then the last group is the defiant. The defiant are those who neither they know what to do, right? So they know the information, but they're unwilling to do it anyways. And we usually find that they come from two different groups. The first group are those who can stomach their way through any training with their arms crossed like this. Information going in one ear and out the other. And the second group, unfortunately, are those who've been to choir and they're just burned. They just don't want to do it anymore, right? And that really gets like the concept of like racial battle fatigue and some of those other pieces. Now, I was presenting this to a conference, and we were talking about this framework, and a funder from the College Futures Foundation approached us to say, "Hey, I think you're missing another group." And they said, "There's a group that you're missing that's absolutely central, that really falls in between both of these categories." And he says, it is the oblivious. The people who think they know what to do and really don't. And there's a number of different groups that this can encompass. So one group of the oblivious are those who we call non-reflective. These are people, tell me if you ever met someone like this. They can use the language of equity all they want. They know that they should say equity versus equality. They know that, hey, I should maybe say Latinx to be more gender inclusive. They can use the language, but everything that they do is totally disconnected from what they say. So they profess equity, but their practice is not that. The second group are those who have a savior complex. And think about this, is when people bring deficit mindsets to equity work. Because you can engage in equity work and still view the communities that you're working with as being lesser than or not important, and maybe even thinking that, hey, it's not even as much about them as my own personal forgiveness or my own personal acceptance, or even in some cases my own public image of doing this work and how it will make me look. So what I find in my work is that this group here is actually the most difficult group to work with, because they think they're on a team and they're really not, and they do more damage than they do good. So that brings us to just some basic data. when we're looking at our black boys in education, we know that there are some differences in outcomes in comparison to their peers. So I'll run through a few charts that are basically things that you probably already know. One, we know that when we're talking about achievement, there's some differences in terms of success. This is basically 4th grade proficiency in reading. You can see that basically black boys on the left-hand side here are most likely to be at below basic or very far below basic, depending upon how it's being measured, and very few represented at the advanced level. And if you start looking at other groups, you find that in general, communities of color are not doing the same as their white peers. We see this in reading. We also see this in mathematics. Some people, again, when they see this data, they say, what's wrong with these guys? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful? And instead, we perceive that it should be viewed from an equity-minded lens. So we say, what are we doing or not doing as a school, as a department, as an educator that's resulting in our boys of color not doing as well as they do? And it's really that important kind of framing where we start to bring it down to a personal lens. In fact, I oftentimes give this quote when I speak, and I think it's a really important way for us to conceptualize this work in general. And it's a quote from W. Edward Deming. Many of you have probably heard it before. It says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Now, I can't tell you how many times I'll go to a school or a college, and I'll say that, and then there'll be educators in the room, and they'll be like, yeah, every system. So you know what? Can you tell the folks at the district office that they need to do this, or they need to focus on that? And I'm like, well, yeah, they're part of the system, but that's not what I was really getting at. Right? It's about bringing it down to a personal level. Every system, every college, or every school, every division, every department, every classroom, every office is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. And it's only when we start bringing it down to that personal level that, one, we can actually make change, but two, we can also realize that there are things that every one of us are doing that are contributing to the outcomes that we see. We see that there are also challenges in terms of exposure to exclusionary discipline. There's been a lot of work that's been done on it. We've released, I think, 3 reports just in the past 6 months focused on suspensions and expulsions, and we have several more that are coming out. We're working on one report that's focused on suspensions in early childhood. It's called Banning the Babies. And then we have another one that's focused on, and it's a statewide report focused on Native Americans that we're doing in partnership with a couple other tribal organizations. And so that's going to focus on looking at what some of those challenges look like in that community. But we can see that in general that our boys of color are more likely to be suspended and are more likely to be expelled. Where you're at in the country, those rates change in terms of what they look like. But that's pretty much the pattern. It's unfortunately very consistent. Of course, all this leads to differences in terms of the outcomes when you get to high school, right? We see here that black males, 52% will graduate high school in a 4-year time frame in comparison to 78% of white males, right? So not that I want to set up necessarily a black-white binary, but it is important to know differences in terms of how students are performing. And that led us to this. And really what I really want to focus on, which is this whole notion that, and I believe we have to say, that black minds matter. I believe that black lives and black minds are intertwined, because if you don't value someone's life, you certainly won't value their mind. And the picture that you see here on your left-hand side, this is Alfred Alonga. Alfred was a Ugandan refugee living in San Diego. He had a friend who had passed away, and he was really affected by that passing. A few days later, his sister noticed that he was acting a little bit out of sorts. He wasn't acting like himself. So they basically called the police and asked for a psychiatric response team to come to basically help him out. Instead of sending the psychiatric response team, a normal unit was sent out. I assume that there was maybe some miscommunication that typically ends up happening. And he was holding something in his hand about this size that was a vape machine. Y'all know what a vape machine is, right? Okay. And standing about as far as I'm standing from what's your name? Kira. Right? Standing about this far away, they shot him and killed him, unarmed. San Diego was embroiled in direct action. There was protests, marches, both on our campus, in the community colleges, at UCSD, on the streets. It was live for a long period of time, because obviously Alfred Alongo is not just one name, but he's indicative of the relationship that oftentimes takes place between police and communities of color. Names such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant III, Amadou Diallo. I mean, I'm just gonna stop. Stephon Clark. There's just been so many, right, who have experienced this kind of this, and then it's a daily experience for many of us. So we were inspired by this event to basically try to do something about it. So many of my students, particularly my Ph.D. students, were engaged in direct action, and I was like, well, that's important. But what are we going to do beyond that to help really demonstrate that this isn't just taking place in policing, but it's taking place in all facets of our society? So we decided to put on a nationally streamed course called Black Minds Matter. And what we did was I took a class that I was going to teach, which was going to be on black males. We called it Black Minds Matter. And then we invited guests, many of whom are in this book here. And we invited guests to basically come and talk about their work and how, so that individuals could learn from it. So it was normally going to be my class of about 10 doctoral students. My class expanded to capacity and had like 25 people for what would be higher than normal for our kind of offerings. And then we decided to basically make it public. And so we put it on live stream the first 2 hours of every session. And we had over 10,000 people who participated. We had 250 either live broadcast or replay broadcast sites throughout the country, and basically have been putting out this message that Black Minds Matter. And we think it's important to say that because, unfortunately, many people don't believe that, tacitly at least, they don't believe it. So we did it as a response to what seems to be persistent and seemingly unchanging data that continues to show that certain groups are not performing at the level of others, and we think that that's a function, again, of the educators and institutions that serve them, and not of the students or their families. It's also a response to what has been the proliferation of zero tolerance policies and other policies such as defiance policies that have really led to an overexposure of black males to two patterns that I already mentioned: overexposure to exclusionary discipline and overplacement in special education. And those are the two pillars of the school to prison pipeline. So when you look at this, this is just images from a school. You have, at this school, random drug searches. You have metal detectors that students walk through. There's surveillance systems. This is on, we switched computers, so this would have been like flying in. You've been able to see some other pictures that aren't being shown here. But what we have are schools that have increasing presence of police officers or school resource officers who are essentially turning our schools in some ways into prisons. And we have to think about the ways that our schools socialize individuals, some of them to go into colleges or in the workforce, and others to go into our criminal injustices. So, and I really like the fact that when we were being asked, what are some things that need to happen, that one of you mentioned love, and I think that that's something that's very important and something that we don't always talk about. Asa Hilliard is a scholar whose work I've been really influenced by. Asa Hilliard was Africanist. He did just Afrocentric pedagogy, Black studies, did just amazing work in education. And one of the things he said was this: I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. And unfortunately, love is not distributed when we're talking about all of our students. There are some students who walk into a classroom and are loved, and there's some students who are rejected. And to me, it's marvelous. And I don't mean marvelous in a positive way. I just mean marvelous in a marvelous kind of way. How you can have two children in the same classroom and they can have totally different experiences. And I think we have to do more about that. What I've seen taking place across the country, though, is a lot of efforts and movements to try to improve student success, recognizing that, hey, equity is important. I look at what's taking place in our local schools. They're establishing restorative justice teams, and they're establishing teams that focus on equity. I look what's taking place in community colleges and universities where they're establishing inclusion plans, and equity plans, and diversity plans. And everywhere you go, you're seeing these kind of structural initiatives that are now taking place that are really important. And I think that the only challenge that I have is that we can create structures, and it doesn't always change outcomes. The other thing that I see as a kind of similar pattern is, let's say that I'm going to a school, and I'm going to be presenting and talking about my work. They oftentimes will say, hey, Luke, can you just bring also with you like a one-page sheet on like just some basic like things that they can do to help improve success for black males? And I'm like, I mean, yeah, I could do that, but ultimately it sometimes will produce more damage than good. Because if you give people strategies, yet you haven't addressed the base of this pyramid, which is their perceptions, then they can bring those, again, those deficit mindsets into equity work. Let me give you a great example. I was working with, our center was working with a college, and there was a training that my colleague Frank had put on, focused on men and masculinities, looking at how some men are apprehensive to seek out help because they perceive that it'll be associated with weakness, right? Then, so he had done this session, then there was another faculty member who had participated in that and then went to a different session on building relationships with students. And they taught them in that session that, hey, you have to build relationships with students. Go outside the classroom, engage students, talk with them, learn about them. This is important. Does anybody disagree with that? No, right? It's important. You have to build relationships. So this faculty member, well-meaning, well-intentioned, is charged up. They're like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to change the world. Right? Gets real excited, walks out the door, and looks to see if they can find somebody, a student, to engage. And they see a black male, they're like, oh, there's one. They walk up to this black male, and I know because I talked to him, and it was a very interesting conversation afterwards. So, professor walks up to the student, says, hi, I'm so-and-so, I teach this. I hear you guys have problems asking for help, so what I would really like to do is to build a relationship with you. So, what sport do you play?
He taught math, right?
I don't know, he probably did. So, maybe you like heard like 3 or 4 like real bad missteps in that. And that's oftentimes what we see, because we can tell people practices, we can tell people how to engage people, but if we have never dealt with their perceptions, their bias, their microaggressions, all that, then oftentimes we're only arming people to do more damage than good. Okay? So this is a depiction of black lives and black minds, and essentially showing the linkage between them. So you see here these roots, and these roots are in the soil, and our soil is informed by supremacy, it's informed by racism, it's informed by dehumanization. And unfortunately, this fertilizes the tree to produce 2 primary patterns. 1, the undervaluing of black lives and black minds, and 2, the criminalization of black lives and black minds. And you can see the fruit that's born from these trees. Use of deadly force, excessive use of force, maintenance order policing, racial profiling, exclusionary discipline, zero tolerance, in-school tracking, and these patterns end up being very similar. And the reason is because of these 2 patterns here. So what we're going to do is look at just 3 of these patterns, which I think are important for us to think about, and because they are 3 of the most pervasive patterns that we see. But I want to just tell you about this chart real quick, and maybe this is a little bit of a commercial, but this is the 2nd session of Black Minds if you want to participate. So essentially what you see here are concepts, right? These are the different ways in which basically there are some similarities. This represents just 10 similarities. You could probably put together a chart that has 50 similarities, right? So, for example, 1 is this notion that black males are oftentimes portrayed as beasts of prey, right? And in policing, there was in the 90s this whole conversation about super predators and what that meant, and framing communities of color, particularly black and Latino males, as being super predators. And at the same time, there's also similar conversations that were taking place in school about super predators in schools, but more oftentimes using the word threats, right? That they're threats, that they're dangerous, that they're deviant, that they're up to no good. And so that's just 1 example. The 3 that we're going to talk about are hypercriminalization, disregard for youthfulness, and community targeting. So this is just one depiction of how this linkage is real. So we released our report on suspensions in Sacramento, and we actually had to postpone the release of the report because unfortunately a young man named Stephon Clark was shot and killed in his own backyard, shot in the back, while his mother was standing and looking at him through the window, holding his baby. I mean, it's like craziness. But I felt like this parallel when I pulled open this online news source and both these stories were next to each other. I thought to myself, they should be next to each other because they're very related. They're very intertwined. So, hypercriminalization. Let's look at black lives. We know that, unfortunately, black males are more likely to be exposed or overexposed to our criminal injustice system. I say injustice because oftentimes there's no justice in it for people who look like the people in this room. When we look at data, we can see, and this is some data that's a little bit older, but there's a quote here that's a little bit newer than that. You can see that basically, when we're looking at ages 18 and older, 1 in 15 are in prison or behind bars, in comparison to 101 and 106 when we're talking about white communities. That's a pretty big difference, right? But what really stands out to me is this thing that came out of the Sentencing Project, which said that 1 in every 3 black American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime. That's sad. Someone said it's sad. Yeah, it is sad. We see in that same report that when we start looking at certain age bands, that there's actually even an increase from what that looks like. So when we're talking about the age band of 20 to 24 all the way up to 30 to 34, you can see that that rate is 1 in 9 behind bars right now. Now, we also see this notion of being hyper-criminalized in terms of how suspensions play out. So these are data from the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, and you can look at this data. This represents black children in general, boys and girls, or I should say students of all genders. 18% account for 18% of preschool enrollment, but account for a much higher percentage of those who are facing out-of-school suspensions and multiple out-of-school suspensions in comparison to their peers. So in an equitable standpoint, this would be equal all the way across, right? But unfortunately, that's not what it looks like. That pattern doesn't stop in preschool. That continues throughout the rest of K-12 education. You can see that black students account for 16% of K-12 education, but 32% of those who receive an in-school suspension, 33% of those who receive an out-of-school suspension, 42% of those who receive multiple out-of-school suspensions. In fact, that's the pattern that we're finding the most, is that a lot of the high suspension rates are a function of certain students being targeted on a routine basis. And that's actually what brought me to this work, because I was one of those students. I grew up in a wonderful, wonderful town in far northern California, and I had many amazing teachers. But when I went to 5th grade, I had a teacher who didn't view me as a student, she viewed me as a threat. And in 5th grade, I was subject to many, many in-school suspensions and a few out-of-school suspensions. In fact, in that year alone, I was suspended 42 times. Now, when I say that, typically the response from an audience is, what did you do to deserve that? What did you do? And even then, that response, what did you do, is part of the problem, because it assumes that I did something wrong. I was the target of a group of boys who were bullying myself and my brother. We were the only black children in the entire school. We were the only ones, and we were routinely called nigglets, cottonheads, N-words to our face on a daily basis. Yet, the response from a lot of people is, well, what did you do to deserve that? And unfortunately, while I had many amazing teachers, I had a teacher in 5th grade who I think had a white hood in her closet. And she routinely targeted me and my brother. But what was fortunate for me was this. The very following year, I had the most amazing teacher that I've ever had, Mr. G, who I'm still connected with even to this day. We go back and forth on social media all the time. He's amazing. And instead of seeing me as a threat or as a problem, he saw a young man who had talent that needed to be cultivated. And he saw that I liked to write. I still like to write. I write too much, as you can tell. There's the bio. Like, why are you writing so much? Because it's fun, right? I find it to be cathartic, and I always have. And so I had this teacher who was like, oh, I'm going to invest in Luke. He took time out of his day to work with me. He sent me to like these young writer camps. And he, like, in 1 year, I went from being what would probably be considered like the worst kid in the class, the worst kid, or the bad kid, because teachers like to do that. They like to pick one student and make them the bad kid as a way of controlling the classroom, to being what might be considered one of the best kids in the class, simply because one teacher looked at me and cared about me. Now, we also see another pattern when we're talking about this work, and that's a disregard for youthfulness. Some people will call this adultification. And what this really gets at is that when police officers are engaging young men, they oftentimes don't see them as young men or as children. They see them as men. Now, I'm going to give you two examples, one with a police officer and one with a, what was he again? He wasn't a police officer.
Security guard?
No, yeah, I guess a security guard. So this first one's with the police, though. Let's go with this one. So this is a picture of Tamir Rice. How many people remember the case of Tamir Rice? Okay. So this is one of the statements that came out of that case. The statement's released Tuesday. The two Cleveland police officers involved in the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice said that they believed the boy was much older than he was, and that Tamir reached for the toy weapon tucked in his waistband before one of the officers opened fire. He wasn't viewed as a young child. He was viewed as a man. See the same thing that happened with the George Zimmerman situation. George Zimmerman admitted at his 2012 bail hearing that he misjudged Trayvon Martin's age when he killed him. I thought he was a little bit younger than I am, he said, meaning just under 28. But Trayvon was only 17. And it's not uncommon for this to happen, for someone to view a black male, see them, and say, okay, well, they're big, they're black, they're male, let's control them. Let's try to restrain them. And let's do it even more aggressively than what we do with anyone else, because we don't view them as kids, we view them as what? As grown men. So there's been work that's also looked at this in terms of how it takes place in terms of suspects. So this is a study that you'll see that was done by Goff and colleagues. What they did is they took 60 police officers and they gave them different scenarios about individuals based upon their race. And what they were asked to do is essentially judge the race of the person. And what they did is that you can see that when it was, let's take the first one here, the white boxes are misdemeanors, that they overjudged white suspects, these were juveniles, their age by about half a year, in comparison to, as you can see, for black and Latino suspects at much higher, at 2.5 years to over 3 years. When it came to felonies, they underjudged the age of those who were white, and they overjudged those who were black by 4.5 years. So again, they viewed them as not young boys, but as Tyrone Howard says, problematic men. Gloria Ladson-Billings, a scholar who you may be familiar with her work because she's awesome. She's done a lot of work focusing on black males as well. And she had done this case study where she basically was doing observations at the school and noticed that there was like this really interesting pattern that when the black boys were young, that they were treated as being cute, but cute in a way where they were viewed as infantiles. So they were treated well in some cases, but they weren't invested in academically because, well, they were black boys by women, right? That was their sense making. But then what she noticed is that once they hit a certain age, it was like it happened almost immediately that they were no longer viewed as boys, but as men. And what would happen is that they would basically try to engage in practices to restrain their movement throughout the school. And if you would go to like a school in another location, there wouldn't be that same kind of treatment, or mistreatment, I should say. So one of the things she says is that the paradox of black boys' experiences in school and society is that mainstream perceptions of them vacillate between making them babies and making them men. Their childhood evaporates before they're 8 or 9 years old, when teachers and other school officials begin to think of them as men. The once cute boys become problematic men. So, there's other studies that have also showed this. And here's one that I found to be particularly powerful. It's also it's a different study by Goff and colleagues. And what it was looking at is the pervasive dehumanization of black children. So, think about it like this. To be dehumanized means that you're not viewed as being a human in the same way that other people are, right? You're viewed as being lesser than. And as a result, you don't have the same kind of rights to the experience that those are who are human have. And they talk about this in a few ways. For example, if you're viewed as being, essentially not human, you can't make mistakes because your mistakes aren't going to be viewed as simply mistakes, right? Because you're a large black boy, you had culpability, right? So a child who, let's say, is on the playground and writes in first grade with an erasable marker on the playground and then is severely reprimanded for something that could have been, hey, can you just clean that up? When they would have done the exact opposite if it was a white child, there becomes a problem, right? Because why? Because they can't make mistakes. They don't have the right to be being viewed as innocent, to be in need of protection, to be nurtured. And basically, this chart's hard to read, and essentially, they find that it happens at about age 10, which interestingly coincides with what her qualitative observations also demonstrated about that same age. And unfortunately, I have very fortunately, I have a son who is 7 years old, and I keep thinking to myself, 2 more years, and then it's going to switch. And I've already seen him have experiences that have given me a lot of pause about the kind of education experience he's going to have, because what I don't want is for him to experience what I experienced. And unfortunately, that may end up being the case. We're going to work on that. Another way that we could look at the combination of black lives and black minds is on community targeting. So, who here has heard of the term hotspot policing? Okay, a few folks around the room. So hotspot policing is in general this idea where, let's say this is a map of a specific area that we're going to focus on for police officers. And these dots represent locations where crimes have occurred. Or maybe where crimes have been reported, because oftentimes these maps don't include the white-collar crime. That's a whole other thing. Talk about that later. Yeah. People say those bad communities, which one are you talking about? So anyways, what they do with this is they identify areas where there's high density, and then the idea is that you want to police those areas that have high density of crime, because the idea is if you want to reduce overall crime, you focus on those areas. The challenge is, as the National Institute for Justice has repeatedly demonstrated, there's no set standard for identifying how you define a hotspot. So every department basically treats it differently. And in my work, what we know is this, is anytime you leave something to subjectivity and opinion, that's where bias will creep in. And then as a result, what we find is this, is that communities of color end up being targeted by police officers. And this is basically one of the things that came out of it, basically trying to critique it. In this quote from Sanchez and Rosenbaum, they said police organizations that measure performance by the numbers, such as arrests, gun seizures, drugs, money, and that deploy large numbers of police officers to minority communities to combat hotspots of crime, could be accused of racially profiling communities rather than individuals, and contributing to disproportionate minority mistreatment, arrests, and confinement. That's black lives. Here's black minds. We see the high presence of school resource officers in schools, and we find that those school resource officers tend to be concentrated in schools that are more minority, or have a higher population of minoritized individuals. That might be a better way of saying it. So what you can see here is just a chart of how that goes up based upon the percentage of the school that is referred to as minority. And so we see that there's a higher presence of these different types of officers, school resource officers, private security, even in some cases police officers, who are engaged at these schools with students on a regular basis. In some ways, preparing them for what may be their life afterwards. So all of this is really indicative of one pattern that we do a lot of work on, and we call this the D3 effect. The D3 effect really gets down to the point that the 3 pervasive ways that black boys are engaged in society is through distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust, they're viewed as being criminals or deviants. And while I'm saying all this and giving very big generalizations, there's also different ways in which this plays out within the community as well, right? Because the black community is a very, very diverse community. It's diverse in terms of ethnicity, it's diverse in terms of religion, it's diverse in terms of skin tone. It's a very diverse community. In fact, I do a lot of work with my colleague Frank. Frank and I run our center together. Frank is darker skinned. Obviously, I'm lighter skinned. I like to tell people I have bad skin and good hair to push back on the typical stereotype. But ultimately, one thing that I find is like this assumption of criminality, it plays out for both me and Frank, but it actually plays out in slightly different ways. Frank is darker skinned, so he's more likely to be viewed as being threatening or aggressive. Whereas me, I'm more likely to be viewed as sly, mischievous, or manipulative, right? Playing on the same notion of criminality, but it plays out in slightly different ways, right? That's just one example of how all these things are diverse within the community. Disdain, when we view communities as being lesser than, and we pathologize the language, the culture, and the communication styles of those who are within those communities. And disregard, where we assume that individuals are essentially academically inferior. Just doing a time check. So let's look at just a couple quick things. So disdain. Again, this is this notion that certain communities are viewed through a pathologized lens. This distrust, disdain, and disregard aligns with Daryl Wing Su's 3 types of microaggressions. He has many different types, but 3 specific ones: pathologizing culture, assumptions of criminality, and ascriptions of intelligence. And what you can see is that oftentimes you'll find that communities of color are viewed as people have deficit perspectives about black students, their families, their homes, their communities, and their schools. Here's some common ways in which that plays out. This is in doing interviews and focus groups with educators and with parents of black children. These are some of the themes that come out most regularly. Dismissal of passion for learning. We hear things like, well, they're lazy, they don't care. In college we hear, oh, they're just here for the financial aid or for sports. They're not really here for school. They're viewed as being futureless, where they don't see a future for themselves. They have nothing to lose, so why should we invest in them? Disregard for structural racism, not recognizing that it has a clear influence on their experience. Instead, we say, oh, they had too many problems. They're troubled. They're part of the cycle of poverty. Notice the they language on that? Parent apathy. Their parents don't really care about school. They really value sports in the school, without thinking about what kind of experience did the parents have. And oftentimes, the parents' experience isn't as good. In fact, has anyone, Malcolm Gladwell's, what is it called? His podcast. Has anyone ever seen it before? No? Okay. So he has one that's called Miss Buchanan's Period of Adjustment, and it talks about what happened with school teachers after Brown versus the Board of Education. So this is a total tangent, but I'm a tangent person, right? So basically, in this podcast, what they're talking about is that when we're talking about before Brown versus the board, before schools became integrated, you had a high population of teachers of color who were teaching children of color. So you had people within that community who were teaching them. And so what would happen is they might not have the best resources at that school, but at the very least, they had people who cared about that community and cared about those children because those were children from their same community. When Brown versus the board went forth to the Supreme Court, one of the focuses of the case was on basically making it so like, hey, if there's a school that's here, I should have the right to be able to bring my child to that school, right? That was the sense that went into it, right? That I should be able to have access to it. But in order for the argument to really be received by the Supreme Court, a lot of the discussion around it was how inadequate the schools were, right? Because the schools, they don't have good professional development structure, if they don't have up-to-date books, if they don't have resources, then those could be viewed as schools that were lesser. So what the Supreme Court did was this. They said, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to integrate students because those schools are bad. And over the period, I believe it was a 10-year period after that, nearly half of the black teacher force was lost. And has only and declined for many years after that. So you had this large period of what this occurred based upon this notion that, oh, well, they're not as good. And then so you have to think about all these parents who've been raised in a society where they've had the same type of treatment in schools, and we say, oh, well, they just don't care. No, they care. Their presence tells us that they care. But oftentimes it's the message they receive from educators that communicate the opposite. Disregard. So disregard is where we assign a certain degree of intelligence based upon a child's race. So one of the things that we found, this deals with some of the work we've been doing in community colleges, is this notion of an apprehension to engage. Anyone ever heard the term engagement? Right? Everyone's heard the term engagement, right? And oftentimes when someone is not engaged, we say that they're disengaged, right? So they're either engaged or they're disengaged. And it suggests something. It suggests that they are doing one or the other of those. But what we find in our work is that many of the black males in our study school aren't engaged, are not doing it because they don't care. They're apprehensive to engage because they're worried about reifying stereotypes that suggest that they're ignorant, that they're stupid, that they're dumb. And these are words that students tell us that they're worried about with their faculty. In fact, they'll say this. They'll say that sometimes a faculty member will ask a question, and I'll know the answer, but I'm not going to say anything. And sometimes they'll garner over like some new information, and I really don't know what's going on. They'll say, does anybody have any questions? And I'll have a question that's burning inside of me, but I don't say anything. And sometimes they'll say, hey, if you need any support, just come to my office hours, and I'll give you some additional support. And they'll say, you know, and I know I need to go, but I'm not going to go. And you say, why? And again, they'll say, because they'll think I'm dumb. They'll think I'm ignorant. They'll think I'm stupid.
Do you mind sharing the name of that podcast again? I was wondering.
Malcolm Gladwell, I can pull it up. It's called Mrs. Buchanan's Period of Adjustment is the actual podcast, but of that specific one. But I forget, the series is called Revisionist History.
Okay.
Wow.
Thank
You
you.
just have to not think about it for a second. It comes to you. Isn't that cool how that works? So this apprehension to engage. Now, this is what we find out on the other side. You also find that faculty members, and this is very common, I sometimes do this as faculty, we have what are called our comfort students. The students who are engaging us, who are showing themselves approved, that they're working hard, they're coming up to us, they're asking us questions. And so oftentimes, if you've got a whole bunch of stuff on your plate, what do? Well, you make difficult decisions. You say, okay, I'm going to spend more time with this person and less time with this person. But what we find is that as a result, they have what's called a prove yourself first stance or an approach me first stance. And then you have students on the other side who are apprehensive to engage, and then the two groups can never meet in the middle. And of course, this all plays into the stereotype thread. One of the things that we've learned as part of this is I just mentioned assumptions of criminality and descriptions of intelligence, but those two patterns can also play together. And in fact, we did a piece that was in the Huffington Post called Too Smart to Succeed, Too Good to Win. And what we talked about in this piece is this, is oftentimes in our interviews, what we'll find, and we find this at many levels of education, is that, let me back up. Let's consider this. What happens when a child outperforms low expectations?
We set their expectations higher.
Now that would be nice. Yeah.
So they assume luck?
They assume that, they assume that doesn't make sense. How could that happen?
Lots of times teachers or educators will get angry.
They get angry? Anything else?
You assume they cheated.
So
It's assumed that they have cheated.
it's assumed that they've cheated. And you just hit on it. It's assumed that they've cheated. And in many of our studies, what we've found is that students will perform well on a test, and then it'll be assumed that they cheated, and then so they'll get a bad grade. And so what we talked about is what happens in, we looked at, basically talked about what happens in politics, what happens in business, what happens in education, when people of color outperform low expectations. And it actually came, this concept, really to me through my twin brother. So I have an identical twin brother. So if you ever run into me and I don't say hi back, you say, oh, you were at Metro, and I was like, and you're like, no, it's him, it's not me. And it's always a good excuse too. And it was great when we would have classes that I couldn't make and he could. But so anyway, I was a twin brother, and we went to college together. And he was taking a class in Spanish. He'd taken 3 years of Spanish in high school, and so he was okay. You know, he knew probably more than most people, and he went to a Spanish class. And he's like, oh, this is a piece of cake. So he went and he basically took the first midterm and killed it, right? In fact, I even remember him calling me afterwards being like, yeah, man, I just slammed my midterm, right? And I was like, oh, cool, that's good for you. Because at the time, I probably didn't show up tomorrow. That's a whole other point for another time. So anyway, so what happened is he then went back to class, and the faculty member was giving back different papers and said, okay, Josh, I need you to come see me in my office. He's like, oh, she's probably going to tell me that I need to get tested out of the class because I'm so good, right? And that's what he was really thinking. Goes to the office hours, she says, I don't know how you did it or how you managed to do this, but we're pretty sure that you cheated on this exam. So what I need you to do is to retake it right now.
Oh my goodness.
And on the spot, asked him to retake the exam. So he took the exam, and being proud of my twin brother, he scored higher the second time than he did the first time. Except we can't clap. Because afterwards she sat and she graded it, and she said, I don't know how you managed to do this a second time, but I'm not going to tolerate it, and gave him an F on the exam.
No.
And then he went to the department chair saying, this is crap, this is unfair, I'm going to file a grade appeal unless you do something about this. And the department chair said, well, the department chair wasn't Nicholas, right? The department chair said, well, do you really want to begin your college career by starting, relationships with faculty where you file grade appeals?
Yes.
Well, at that time, he wasn't as bold as he is now, and he ended up receiving a C in the course.
Get out.
Yeah. And we see that pattern across many institutions. We have tons of quotes from students where they describe very similar things on papers that they've written. We got one where a student, he wrote a paper on police brutality, and a faculty member got mad because he said, oh yeah, I was just noticing that the writing in your paper doesn't match the way that you speak. So I don't think this is actually your writing. And basically said, but I don't have any proof, so I'm going to let you go this time, but you better be careful. Right? So those are the kind of things that we see. In fact, there's one of them right there. All right, last one. Distrust. We talked about this one the most. This is part of the D3 effect, is where we view black males as being distrustful. Yeah, I said that. Thanks for helping for the assist. So, in general, right, we can view morality ranging from someone who is moral to immoral, and somewhere in the middle would be kind of amoral, not having a moral or immoral characterization. When we're talking about black males, more often than not, they're presented as immoral, but if they are presented as something else, it's usually presented as amoral, right? So we know that that is one of the reasons that there are some major challenges. I mentioned hypercriminalization. When we look at the work that we've been doing, looking at microaggressions in early childhood, we oftentimes find that these characterizations come from parents, that black boys are singled out. You have two boys who are playing on the schoolyard, and they're both been socialized as boys to engage in some form of aggressive play. So one child can be lauded and praised for engaging in that type of play, while at the same time a black child can be reprimanded and receive a referral for doing the exact same thing. So oftentimes you'll find that they're singled out, that they're over-regulated for minor innocuous actions. So the idea is, hey, if we over-police the small things, then big things won't happen. Except what it does is it creates dissension, and then when you have the students who exhibit defiance, right? And defiance is oftentimes a way of a child of expressing how they're feeling in that environment. So oftentimes we think defiance is actually not necessarily a negative thing, but really a crime, right? Misidentified when no wrongdoing has occurred, right? You fit the description, right? Fit the description of a black male in his 20s, or a black male teenager. And that's the full description. That's not cool. Right? Subject to reverse causality. Some of you may have seen this before, particularly those who are in service, where you'll have a child who goes up to a teacher to say, this is something that happened to me, black child, and then the teacher, instead of saying, who did that to you, what can I do, will say, what did you do to cause that to happen? Right? It's basically an assumption, of course, that they must have caused it. Recipients of punishments is harsher, they're quicker, they're prolonged, and being viewed through a disorder-based lens. I want to just read you some quotes from some of the work that we've been doing. It's a study called Our Voices that I'm doing with my wife, Dara. She's in our early childhood department at San Diego State. She's an assistant professor, and her work is on racial microaggressions in early childhood. And it's so awesome. I was like, thank you for letting me be on this project. So here's a few quotes that came out of that study, and it goes in line with these patterns here. My son is the only black child among his two close friends. When involved in an incident where the three boys were goofing off during class, my son was the only one sent to the principal's office by his teacher in first grade. That's an example of being singled out. Here's an example of being subject to punishments that are quicker, harsher, and more prolonged. My son's first grade teacher would call home for every little fraction. Some of the punishments were often severe for even a small thing and didn't match the crime, such as turning around in his seat one time will result in the whole day being marked as bad. Y'all know that's developmentally appropriate. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on. I don't feel like he got all the support he needed from his teacher that year. And the last one basically goes with this notion of being viewed through a disorder-based lens. In first grade, my son's teacher yelled at him because he wouldn't put his head down. She called me and told me that I need to apply for Social Security for him and that he needs to be taken to see a mental health professional because there is something not clicking in his head. And we have several papers, and part of even the book, of the Black Minds Matter book, there's some of these quotes that are in there that basically are basically portraying what this pattern looks like. So, getting to the point of closing, Black Minds Matter is happening again. It is a 10-week professional development course that's totally free. We'll have a live session that will happen on October 8th, right? Where basically we'll do 1 hour. It's really just more of a kickoff. Then what we've done is we've taken all the content from the first class, we've condensed it down into basically shorter videos that are a little bit more consumable. Because some of them went on for like 2.5 hours, so they're down to about more like an hour each. We created assignments that go along with it and activities. We created discussion questions, and it's out there launching on October 8th as a free of charge resource for any educator who wants to use it as a way of helping to improve their capacity to do this work. We already have over 200 sites that are signed up. This is some of the sites from the first time, this time, and last time. The different colors represent sites that were either live broadcast sites last time or did it as replay, meaning that they didn't watch it in real time but played it a few days later, as well as some of our new sites as well. So if you want to participate, again, it's free. Not everything in life is free, so having something that's free is kind of cool. There's the link to register. Oftentimes what people will do is they'll do it in groups. They'll do it like this, where they'll register a site, they'll sit in a room, they'll watch the things. There's the activities that go with it. They'll have a moderator who does the discussion. We have student groups who lead it, libraries, schools, colleges, universities, nonprofit organizations, a lot of organizations that are involved in participating. So you can see some of the names of the highlight list of scholars who participated. Tyrone Howard, Patrice Cullors. Basically what we tried to do was split it between those who were academicians and those who were activists, and then of course people who represent both communities. So one of the people we had was Patrice Cullors, who is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. We had Esley Merritt, who is one of the main lawyers for Black Lives Matter. We had Ilyasa Shabazz, who is the daughter of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz. Pedro Noguera, Jawanza Kunjufu, Donna Ford, who is amazing. Amazing. I gotta say that one more time. She's amazing. Okay, I said it a few times. So I felt like since we have a few minutes left, I'm going to wrap it up in just 5 minutes and give you 5 more minutes and then we'll just talk. I just thought I should probably conclude with some recommendations since I did a lot of saying what we should be doing, maybe say what we should. How about that? Okay, so first thing I believe that we need, and these are recommendations for 2 different areas. So the first one, this focuses on recommendations that came from our Get Out series of reports. So this is really focused on suspensions and expulsions. So we believe that we need intensive, ongoing professional development. Why? Because educators are not prepared to engage our population. No matter whether we're talking about elementary school, middle school, university, educators are not prepared to engage this population. But let me tell you where I see the biggest and most acute issues are actually community colleges and universities. And I'll tell you why. Let's say that I'm going to be a biology professor at a community college. For the most part, my experience would be like this. I would go and I'd get a bachelor's degree in biology. I'd go and work in industry for a couple years. I'd get a master's degree in biology, and I'd get hired to go teach in the classroom. No training on how to teach, no development, just thrown into the classroom. So then this is what people do. They teach how they were taught. They think about who are the good professors that I had? What are some things that they did? Let me take some of those things and make it part of my own practice. And so they essentially learn on the job. And what we find is that when they teach how they are taught, typically how they are taught is not how our students of color learn. So there's an incredible need for development. Now that's not just a failure in their onboarding. That's also a failure in those of us who teach in colleges of education, who haven't really done a good enough job of creating a teacher force that is diverse and a teacher force that is aware of how to engage populations that are different than themselves. Now, that's one of the things that I think is so cool about being here today, is that this institution was founded with that as a mission. That's amazing. You know, it's amazing. So I believe that's important. We also found in our reports that foster youth are a group who are oftentimes overexposed to exclusionary discipline. Having been a former foster youth, when I see that data, it hurts my heart because that's me, that's my brothers, that's my sisters, and I know what that experience is like. We believe that we have to assess existing discipline policies because, unfortunately, they're tacitly racist. And unfortunately, many of them are gray, and again, whenever we leave openness for subjectivity to creep in, we're going to have problems. One of the things we also recommended is the total elimination of suspension in early childhood education, which is incredibly important because, again, if we find across our state in California that students in early childhood who are black males are 4.5 times more likely to be suspended than their peers, and again, in Sacramento County, our state capital, 9.9 times more likely, then we got a problem, right? We have a problem, and we have to focus on that. Providing avenues for students' voice. One of the guests on Black Minds Matter, Chance Lewis, said, you know, if you want to know who the bad teachers are in a school, just ask the students. They can tell you. And so, you know what? We decided to put that to the test. So we've been working with a school, and that's having some really bad dynamics between the black students and their families and the teachers. And at the school, it's predominantly African American and Somali parents, right? All working together to address this issue. And what was taking place is that students were being put on lists that would prevent them from being able to participate in extracurricular activities. They were not being given access to be able to have recess. So, okay, he's rambunctious. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell him he can't go to recess. So that's going to help us become less rambunctious. So, you know, I don't understand the logic behind that, but someone does. Two even more overt forms of racism, which I don't really want to talk about, but there's a, but if you want to come talk to me afterwards, I can give you some examples of what that looks like. So what we did is this. We gave the students a list of teachers at the school, and we said, we want you to just go through and tell us, and this was first graders, who are the teachers who are nice, who are the teachers who are mean, who are the teachers who are somewhere in the middle. And it was amazing how they all could pick out the teachers who, all the complaints that the parents were having were totally aligned with what the students were saying about what are the teachers they should be concerned with. And in first grade, a kid being able to go through and being like, Mr. Woods, I don't really know him. Miss Sanchez, oh, she's amazing. She's so nice, so nice. Mr. Harris, he's okay. You know, and then they would just be able to go through and identify great teachers and bad teachers. We have to ask people. We have to ask them. So those are just some things. I could go into all of them. I will bash on restorative justice for a minute, just because, why not? Restorative justice is a great alternative. We believe it's important if it's actually restorative justice. Unfortunately, most of what we see as restorative justice is, I don't know, restorative joke? Yeah. It's a joke, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a joke. So, given that you all like kind of shook your heads, I'm not going to go deep on that because I think you probably could give the lecture on that yourselves. All right, I'm going to conclude with just some recommendations that we have when we go to community colleges. You'll see some things that are similar, but also some things that are different, right? So one, we think it's important to leverage existing initiatives. Every school, college, or university has an initiative at some point that's taking place. Whether it's a diversity initiative, in community colleges across the country, they're doing equity plans, there's guided pathways, there's acceleration of developmental education, all these different things that are taking place. We think that we're going to move forward the agenda for populations that are oftentimes not at the table and totally ignored, then we have to leverage those initiatives. We have to make sure that we have representatives who get on those initiatives and participate. Why? Because that's oftentimes where the resources are. And a lot of this work simply can't be done without some resources to do it. We believe it's important to participate in statewide and regional consortia. We have our consortium that we operate that many community colleges participate in, and there's many other consortia that we recommend. There's the Coalition for the Education of Boys of Color, COSBEC, which I would also recommend. Buy-in and urgency from campus leadership. This is one thing that in fact, I just recently went to a campus. I sat down with the president, and I said, if you want us to work with you, it's kind of cool when you're courageous at the point where you can say that. But if you want us to work with you, then what you'll have to do is this. One, you'll have to give us your convocation and let us talk about the importance of this work. Why? Because convocation is one of the most sacred spaces for any college or university president. Second thing you'll need to do is you'll need to send out an email to everyone on campus telling them that this is important and it's a sense of urgency around it. Third thing you're going to have to do is have other leaders who are on campus be directly involved in messaging the importance of this work, because what we find is this. If a campus invites me in to come and help them engage in some form of diversification effort, and it's a dean who's inviting me in, or a vice president who's inviting me in, and the president's not on board, we're just simply not going to be as effective. Like, we can have pocketed success, like, hey, math department wants us to come in. We can work with math and make math awesome, but English is still going to suck, right? History is still going to be bad. Cultural studies will still be microaggressing people in cultural studies, right? So there'll still be issues. So what we say is you have to have all that in order to be able to actually move forward an institutional initiative. So you need the president, the vice president of instruction, the vice president of academic affairs, if it's a university, the provost, a board member, faculty senate, faculty union, staff senate, staff union, and all present at the same time, making the same statement that we all stand behind this. Because it only takes one of them to deviate for it to basically ruin the work. Instance of ongoing professional development, I mentioned that before, but what should that be on? Bare minimum, unconscious bias, racial microaggressions, teaching practices for underserved students, cultural competency. And when we're talking about universities, if you're an Anapesi, which this institution is, that should be part of that professional development. What does it mean to be an Anapesi? My institution, we're at HSI. What does it mean to be an HSI? What does it mean to be a PDI, a predominantly black institution? Those are important designations that carry with them a lot of meaning and importance. Being intrusive with engaging those resistors. So, remember how I told you at the very beginning, and you can tell I'm wrapping up and I'm bringing it back to something at the very beginning. That wasn't perfect what just happened, so it's kind of cool. But remember at the very beginning, I said that, sometimes you'll go out and you'll do training on microaggressions, and the people who show up are the people who already know what to do. So one of the ways that we found of getting around that is to go to the places and spaces that they're already at. Convocation, department meetings, division meetings, staff meetings, all faculty days, all staff days, flex days. Why? Because they have to be there. And then what we do, we specialize in providing them with data. At first we would provide them with quantitative data, and then they'd be like, oh, well, those are numbers, but what about the experiences? And I'm like, okay, I got you. So then we would provide them with qualitative data too. And then it'd be like, okay, well, and when we were only doing qualitative, then it was, okay, but what about the numbers? So we started putting both of them together. And then one day we were presenting at a campus, and we were presenting the results from our work with faculty and the staff on how students are experiencing the campus. And there was a person who was running an emotion program, which is a black student retention program, who had invited the students to come. And the students, and we were like, they said, do you mind? I'm like, no, cool, we're glad they're here. Maybe they'll have something to say. And then in the middle of the presentation, we put up a slide about how students feel about the campus, and saying that I feel unwelcome here, I feel lonely here, I don't think my professors care about me. And then a faculty member raises his hand, he's like, I know you got all that fancy, data that you did, and all those quotes and everything. I'm not saying that you did anything wrong, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I have a hard time from my own experience seeing that as accurate. So I just don't think it's accurate. Which is a good way of getting around asking a methodological question about how we collected it or how we analyzed it or how we did it. right? Because then it's just I feel, right? So it's hard to argue that. Because when they hit me with methods questions, I'm like, awesome. That's an alley-oop, because that's what I do, right? So, but what happened is there were students who were in the room, and one of the students raised their hand and said, I'm sorry, can I say something real quick? It's like, what that experience that they're describing there, that happened to me yesterday. And then went through and described it, and then the other students in the room started like reverberating off that student, and then they started sharing, and they started sharing, and they started sharing, and you saw an audience that was going from this, because they're mad, I mean, it wasn't good data, right? So even their body language changed, and they're like, okay, maybe we need to do something about this, right? And so what we try to do is do that, hit them with that trifecta, and the goal is to do this. When we're talking about our choir, it's to empower them. With our allies, it's to educate them. With the oblivious, it's to enlighten them, because they need enlightenment. And when we're talking about our passive resistors, which represents that demographic, our goal is to educate them and to encourage them. And specifically, we want to encourage them to care. Because if we can get them to care, then we can get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary. Last slide, I promise. We also believe that we have to be different in terms of how we hire people. How we hire people makes no sense at most levels of education. So first of all, let's just admit that the interview doesn't really help us get candidates that we need. Anyone here ever been asked the diversity question on an interview? All right, tell me if it sounds something like this. Can you tell me about your experiences in working with diverse student populations? Anyone ever heard that before? Okay. So what that tells you about is their exposure to diversity and not their commitment, and those are two very different things. It would be better for us to say, can you give me 3 specific ways in which you change your teaching and learning practice to meet the needs of diverse learners? And have them give you 3 specific things that they've actually done. Then you have an idea of what they've actually done, not just saying, oh yeah, well, I was part of this diverse club and I went to this diverse school. Because people can say that all they want, because we can have diversity without inclusion. You can be in a space that's diverse and never engage people who are different. Equity-minded institutional research, we have to have data that's helpful. We have to engage people in making sense of their data. And then I guess the last thing I'll conclude with is that when we're talking about communities of color, we also have to recognize that there's oftentimes systemic oppression that they're facing. And as a result of that systemic oppression, they're more likely to experience challenges such as food insecurity, housing insecurity, employment barriers, transportation concerns. In fact, those end up being the big 4. And what we find in our work is that, in general, especially when we're talking about college students, if they have one, they usually have the others. And what we find, so here's an example of that. 75% of students who experience acute food insecurity are also housing insecure. It makes sense, right? Because those are 2 things that are very intertwined. And so we have to recognize that. And we also know that they're experiencing employment barriers. And this is what we find in terms of employment. And this is what we found when we did our work with black males in community colleges, is we found that they're in jobs with 3 primary characteristics. First, they're in jobs that are physically demanding. Moving boxes, digging ditches, stocking shelves, doing construction site cleanup. Second, they're in jobs that occur late at night. So they either work the late night shift or the overnight shift. Interviewed a student, many students, and this is what they'll say, oh yeah, I do construction site cleanup. We can't leave until it's clean because it has to be ready for the day crew to come in. Like, okay, so what time do you get off work? Well, sometimes 3:30, sometimes 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, wow, what time's your first class? 8 a.m. I was like, dang. And then you got this student who's working all night, who's probably experiencing challenges of food insecurity and housing insecurity. We know that those students are also traveling farther distances to get to the campuses that they're going to. That student shows up to class after all of that. They sit in the back of the class. Maybe they walk in a couple minutes late because of transportation concerns. One bus arrives late, one bus leaves early, and they're a few minutes late to class. That happens all the time. And the faculty member sees in the back of the class as a seat. They don't care. They're not really here for school. They're just here for socializing. So he just showed up to my class again later. He doesn't care. Why is he even here? And that's what happens. So we believe that this whole notion of addressing food insecurity or housing insecurity or transportation concern, like oftentimes those are things that are done in isolation, but they don't happen in isolation. Our most recent data with black males in community colleges found that while a third of students experience housing insecurity, ranging from being homeless to having some form of housing instability, such as living in an apartment with too many people, or sleeping in a car, sleeping in a closet, sleeping on a friend's couch or garage, that while a third of students experience that, 48% of black males do. And while 12 to 13% experience the most acute form of food insecurity, nearly a quarter of black males do. So when we're talking about these populations, and we have educators who are engaging them from the standpoint that they don't care, that they're lazy, they're not really here for school, that hurts me. Because they're not just talking about them, they're talking about me. Because if they'll say that about those students, they'll say the same things about my productivity behind my back as a faculty member. So all of this is intertwined. That's why this was preschool through Ph.D. I just want to thank you for your time, and hopefully that was didactic. Any questions, comments, fears, trepidations? I talk a lot, so sorry.
You mentioned preschools and what to do about those preschool suspensions. Was that just for public preschools, or for also like the private ones? Like we have KinderCare here, and I don't know about California, but we have some privately owned early childhood type schools. So I'm just curious as to.
Yeah, so that was data from the U.S. Office of Civil Rights. My understanding is that is public preschools. So obviously there's not a whole lot of public preschools. Let me say this though. I want to point out something because I think it's important, because you asked about designation. I think that there's actually some big differences we have to pay attention to. So nationally, if you look at data, you'll find that public schools that are quote unquote traditional, which I hate that, but traditional public schools have higher suspension rates. And then what you'll find is you look at data for like magnet schools or charter schools or private schools, you'll oftentimes find that their rates are substantially lower. Don't be fooled. It's merely because they have different practices to help people around. So even when we look at that data, we have to recognize that the data that we oftentimes see is severely underreported. So for example, let's take an in-school suspension here. In-school suspension is all based upon whether it's actually documented. So for example, I mentioned I was suspended 42 times. Do you think that my record as a student said I was suspended that many times? Probably not. Right? Because what happens? Sometimes we have what are called blind in-school suspensions, where you'll bring a student into the office area, into the library, and we'll sit them there for the rest of the day, maybe even part of the next day, and then we'll send them back to class. And they'll treat it as more of a pull-out than an actual suspension. But anytime you're removed from a learning environment and you're missing course content for a substantial period of time, that's a suspension, because you, in essence, been excluded from a learning environment. So I'm glad you asked that point, because I was hoping I was going to say that and I forgot, and you actually reminded me to say it, so thank you. Any other questions? I'll go here and here.
Yeah, so in that same experience, didn't any of the teachers in K to 4th grade come up to your 5th grade teacher and be like, "He's a good kid, what's going on?" Did no one realize?
No, didn't realize. You know, in all, if I will say in all fairness, they was in different wings of the school, so there may not have been as much crossover with those teachers. Who could have been like, "What are you doing?" You know, but that's kind of what happened. It was a tough experience. I mean, I actually remember another experience that I oftentimes share. It happened around the same time, and that's when the O.J. Simpson trial occurred. And basically, or I shouldn't make any assumptions, but my guess is most people know, have heard of the O.J. Simpson trial. Did everyone make an assumption? All right. So what they did in our school is they thought that this was an important moment in history, right? Because O.J. Simpson was this beloved athlete, actor who had done all these great things, and now he's being accused of committing a murder. You know, what happened? This is important. We want our students to be part of this history. So when the verdict was about to be read, they brought all of us into the library, which was the only place in the school that time that had a TV, and they turned the TV on for the verdict to be read. And then it was not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And you should have heard gasps, moans. And then after that, like the racist language started to flow. He's an animal. What a brute. he needs to be killed. Someone should take him outside and execute him, which is, it's a little racy when you say that, right? So that's like a formative experience that's always stuck in my mind. But I think it was also in some ways for me a good experience because it helps you sometimes to see where people are coming from. When they let their guard down and you get to see them expose their inner self. So we'll go here, and there, and we'll call it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you can go back a few
Yep.
slides from the end. I was trying to get a website.
This one?
Yeah, that, something like that.
Yep.
Thank you.
And your question?
You know, in Minneapolis, I work for Minneapolis Public Schools, and there's a lot of charter schools that are called patriotic schools. But when you look at their data, they have higher suspension rates.
Yep.
And they have parental forms that these parents have to sign that say if the kids have an expectation behaviorally or academically, they push them out.
Yep.
And where do they go? The public schools.
Yep.
And then the public schools then have to teach these kids, because we teach anyone that wants to do it. But what's happening is they're taking kids away from the public schools, the ones whose parents are really on board, the ones that they don't want to educate, they send out the door.
Yeah.
And what can we do to stop this? It's ridiculous. Because the public schools are the ones, and then those are the ones that go into special ed programs.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so we have higher special ed numbers, and I don't know.
So I was going to answer, but you shot your hand so quickly, I think you had a response.
I don't think anyone would ever say the issue is adding more schools. So, I mean, when overpopulation in schools is a problem, adding more schools, however that can be done, is a way to help with that problem.
Yeah.
And it's not always done as well as it could be. But when you have public schools for the past 10, 20 years, 30 years, where the standard is 28, 29 students in a classroom, and a charter school where the standard is 18 to 20, that's not because of public schools, that's because those students are being given an option that they weren't given in a public school. That's it. Like, I mean, I'm not saying like that's it, like final, but that's,
Yeah.
you know, it's a simpler thing.
So my response would be this. What we need to do is do what we did with the Get Out reports. We basically expose the data. And when we expose the data, if there's no quantitative data, then we basically elicit narratives from parents. And we basically release that as part of a report, and then we have ongoing efforts associated with it. So I'll give you an example. So with Sacramento, we released a capital suspensions report. We coordinated with the media to make it so that it really got out there. After that, we have done a series of different town halls where myself, Frank, and Tyrone Howard, the three co-authors on the report, have come and basically talked with the community about the data and ways that they can better hold the schools accountable. Then what those community members have done is they have packed school board meetings saying, there's this data right here. What are you doing about this? And then basically what we're working with them is how do we create a sustained structure? Because if they think you're gonna go away, then guess what? Nothing's gonna happen. They'll be like, oh, this will pass. But if they know that you're coming back and they're gonna continue to ask the same questions, then there's gonna be more likely that they'll be held accountable. So I really believe in using research as a way of better holding schools accountable for what they do. It's kind of where academics meets activism. And I think that in my work as an applied researcher, I really started out as more of a pure researcher, now more of an applied researcher. I found that to be much more beneficial in actually trying to create change. And you see people who are creating change. In Sacramento, they've already started changing some of their policies. They've already started doing some different trainings with their teachers. But that's, that's only one small part of it. But I think that's one strategy to help address some of it.